The diner had always been a place of warmth, the kind of spot where golden afternoon light spilled through large glass windows, where the aroma of fresh coffee and sizzling bacon felt like a quiet promise that kindness still existed in the world. The checkered floor gleamed beneath rows of chrome-trimmed tables, and the hum of soft jazz drifted from an old radio behind the counter. It was the kind of place where strangers became regulars, where laughter mingled with the clink of ceramic cups, where people came not just to eat, but to feel human again. But that afternoon, the warmth shattered like fragile porcelain. The moment that changed everything for Elena began with laughter. Cruel, jagged laughter that sliced through the comfortable murmur of conversation like a blade through silk. Three men stood before her booth, their shadows falling across her untouched plate of scrambled eggs and toast. The leader, a stocky man with greasy hair slicked back and a sneer carved permanently into his face, loomed over her with the kind of arrogance that came from years of never being challenged. His friends flanked him, one tall and wiry with a scar running down his cheek, the other short and round, grinning like this was the best entertainment he'd had all week. Elena sat frozen, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had come to this diner seeking anonymity, a brief escape from the weight of a name that carried too much history, too much expectation. She wore simple clothes, a cream-colored blouse, faded jeans, and worn sneakers. Nothing that would draw attention, nothing that would mark her as anyone important. But cruelty doesn't discriminate. "Look at this one," the leader sneered, his voice loud enough to turn heads. "Sitting here all high and mighty. Think you're too good to talk to us, sweetheart?" Elena's throat tightened. She kept her eyes down, hoping silence would make them lose interest. But silence, she would learn, only fed their hunger. "Hey!" the scarred one barked, slamming his palm on the table. The sound cracked through the diner like a gunshot. Her water glass trembled. "He's talking to you." "Maybe she needs a lesson in manners," the round one chuckled, his breath reeking of stale cigarettes. Before Elena could react, before she could even draw breath to speak, the leader reached forward with both hands and gripped the front of her blouse. The rip of fabric was deafening, louder than the jazz, louder than the sizzle of the grill, louder than her own heartbeat, which felt like it might explode from her chest. The delicate cream fabric tore down the middle, buttons scattering across the table and floor like fallen stars. Elena gasped, her hands immediately flying up to clutch the torn pieces together, her whole body trembling as shame flooded her veins like ice water. She wasn't a stranger to judgment. Being who she was, she'd faced whispers and stares her entire life. But this was different. This was humiliation painted in broad daylight, witnessed by a room full of strangers who suddenly found their plates very interesting. Tears blurred her vision. She bit down hard on her lip to keep from sobbing, but her hands shook so violently she could barely hold the torn fabric closed. The bullies erupted in laughter. If you believe that kindness should never be silent, that standing up for others matters even when it's hard, please take a moment to like this video and drop a comment below. Have you ever witnessed someone being humiliated in public? What did you do? Let's talk about it. The scarred man slapped the leader on the back. "Did you see her face?" he howled. The round one kicked the leg of her booth, making everything rattle. "Not so proud now, are you?" Around them, the diner had gone deathly quiet. Forks paused midair. Coffee cups hovered at lips. A mother covered her young daughter's eyes. An elderly man at the counter looked away, guilt etched into every line of his weathered face. No one moved. No one spoke. Fear, Elena realized, was contagious. It spread through the room like smoke, suffocating courage before it could even spark. She sat there small and trembling, her vision swimming with tears she refused to let fall. She thought of her brother, of Alexander, and the way he'd always told her to be strong, to never let the world see her break. But Alexander wasn't here. He was supposed to be hundreds of miles away, attending to matters of the estate, managing the responsibilities that came with a title older than most nations. He had no idea she'd driven to this small town, seeking refuge from the suffocating expectations that came with being a duke's sister. She never imagined that his name, His title would one day mean the difference between despair and deliverance. The leader leaned in closer, his breath hot and sour against her face. "What's wrong, princess? Cat got your tongue?" And then, as if the universe itself had been holding its breath, everything changed. The gentle chime of the diner's door opening carried with it a presence that shifted the very air. The sound of footsteps, measured, deliberate, expensive leather against checkered tile, followed. Elena didn't look up immediately. She couldn't, but everyone else did. Conversations didn't just pause, they died. The sizzle of the grill seemed to quiet. Even the jazz from the radio felt like it dropped in volume, as if making room for something, someone, far more commanding. Sunlight poured through the doorway, framing two figures in perfect silhouette. The first was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than most people in the diner made in a month. His dark hair was swept back, his jawline sharp enough to cut glass. And his eyes, steel gray and absolutely unforgiving, scanned the room with the precision of a predator assessing prey. Beside him stood another man, older, wearing a black suit and tie, his silver hair immaculate, his posture military straight. His expression was carved from stone. They weren't rushing, they weren't shouting. They were simply walking, calmly, purposefully, their eyes locked on the scene unfolding before them. Three men standing over a trembling young woman clutching a torn shirt to her chest. And then, as if time itself stuttered, the first man's gaze found hers. Recognition flashed across his face. First disbelief, then something far more dangerous. Alexander had never been a man who needed to raise his voice. His silence carried more weight than most people's screams. He had spent his entire life learning the language of power, of influence, of consequences that didn't need to be spoken to be understood. But in that moment, seeing his baby sister, his Elena, humiliated, terrified, violated in a place that should have been safe, something ancient and primal ignited behind his carefully controlled exterior. The three bullies finally noticed the shift in the room's atmosphere. They turned, their laughter dying in their throats like poisoned words. They saw the suits, the posture, the unmistakable aura of wealth and power that radiated from the two men like heat from a furnace. The leader's sneer faltered. His hands, still raised from his moment of cruelty, began to shake. His scarred friend took a step back, his bravado evaporating. The round one went pale, sweat beading on his forehead. Alexander's footsteps echoed through the silent diner. Slow, deliberate, inevitable. The older man remained near the door, his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes cataloging every face in the room, marking them, remembering them. No one dared breathe. Elena finally looked up through her tears, and her breath caught when her eyes met her brother's. And in that moment, she knew. Everything was about to change. Alexander stopped 3 feet from the booth, his presence filling the space like a storm cloud. Up close, he was even more imposing, 6'3" of controlled fury wrapped in bespoke tailoring. His steel gray eyes, the same shade as Elena's, moved from his sister's tear-stained face to the torn fabric she clutched, then slowly, deliberately, to the 3 men who had made the worst mistake of their lives. "Elena," he said quietly, his voice carrying the refined accent of old money and older titles. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, unable to find her voice. Her throat felt like it was closing, emotions warring inside her. Relief, shame, fear, gratitude, all tangled together in a knot she couldn't untie. The leader of the bullies tried to salvage the situation, his voice cracking as he spoke. "Listen, man, we were just... I wasn't speaking to you." Alexander's words were ice. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "In fact, I don't recall giving you permission to breathe in my presence, let alone speak." The older man by the door pulled out his phone, his fingers moving with practiced efficiency. He didn't say a word, but the implication was clear. Calls were being made. Documentation was happening. Consequences were being set in motion. Elena had always known her brother was powerful. As the 12th Duke of Ashford, Alexander controlled an estate that sprawled across 3 counties, managed investments worth hundreds of millions, and carried a name that opened doors most people didn't even know existed. But she'd spent her whole life trying to escape that shadow, to be seen as Elena, just Elena, not as an extension of a title, not as a bargaining chip in high society's endless games. That's why she'd driven here, to this small town 3 hours from the estate. She'd needed space to think, to breathe, to figure out who she was when she wasn't wearing designer dresses at charity galas or smiling politely at suitors twice her age that the family's advisors deemed suitable. She'd wanted to be invisible for just one afternoon. Instead, she'd learned a terrible truth. Sometimes invisibility made you an easier target. "Stand up," Alexander said gently, extending his hand to her. His voice had softened, but only for her. "Come here, little sister." Elena hesitated, her hands still clutching the torn blouse. Shame burned through her, not because of what had happened, but because she felt like she'd somehow failed. Failed to be strong, failed to protect herself, failed to live up to the strength she saw in her brother's eyes every day. "Elena," Alexander's voice cracked just slightly, and she looked up to see something she rarely witnessed: fear. Not for himself, never for himself, but for her. "Please." That single word, wrapped in vulnerability, broke through her paralysis. She stood on shaking legs, and Alexander immediately removed his suit jacket, wrapping it around her shoulders with a gentleness that contradicted everything about his imposing presence. The jacket was warm, smelling of expensive cologne and safety. It swallowed her smaller frame, but she pulled it tight around herself, finally able to release her death grip on the torn fabric. "Mr. Pembroke," Alexander said without looking away from his sister, addressing the older man by the door. "Yes, Your Grace." "The local authorities. How long?" "Sheriff's already en route. 4 minutes out." Pembroke's voice was measured, professional. "I've also contacted our legal team and security. They're mobilizing now." The three bullies had gone from pale to ashen. The word grace hung in the air like an executioner's blade. The leader's knees actually buckled slightly. Your Grace?" the scarred one whispered, the realization crashing over him like a wave. "As in, the Duke?" Alexander's eyes finally shifted to them, and what the bullies saw there made them wish they'd never been born. "You put your hands on my sister. You humiliated her. You violated her in a room full of witnesses who were too frightened to help her." His voice was quiet, conversational even, which somehow made it more terrifying. "Tell me, and think very carefully about your answer. Why shouldn't I destroy everything you've ever touched?" It wasn't a threat. Threats implied possibility. This was a simple statement of capability. The round one actually whimpered. Around the diner, people began to understand what they were witnessing. Phones were slowly being put away. The elderly man at the counter had gone white as fresh snow. The mother with the young daughter looked like she might be sick. They had all sat there. They had all watched. They had all chosen silence. And now they understood exactly what kind of person they'd failed to protect. Elena touched her brother's arm. "Alexander," she whispered, "I just want to leave. Please." She watched the war play out across his face, the desire for vengeance battling against her needs, her comfort, her wishes. For a long moment, she didn't know which would win. Finally, he placed his hand over hers, still resting on his arm. "Whatever you want," he said softly. "Always whatever you want." But then he leaned down. His voice dropping to a whisper meant only for her. "But Elena, if I don't address this, if I don't make this right, they'll do it again. Maybe not to you, but to someone else's sister, someone else's daughter, someone who doesn't have anyone to stand up for them." Elena's breath caught. She looked at the three men, still frozen in terror, then at the diner full of people who'd chosen their own comfort over her dignity. What would you do in Elena's position? Would you want justice, or would you just want to escape? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'm really curious what you'd choose. She thought about all the times she'd felt powerless, all the times she'd bitten her tongue and played the role expected of her. She thought about every girl who'd sat where she sat, suffered what she suffered, and had no one come through that door. "Then make it right," she said quietly, her voice steadier than she felt. "But I don't want revenge, Alexander. I want justice. There's a difference. Her brother's expression softened with something that looked almost like pride. Justice, he agreed. Nothing more. Nothing less. The sound of sirens began to wail in the distance, growing closer, and the three men who'd laughed at a frightened girl in a diner finally understood. They hadn't just torn a blouse, they'd torn the fabric of their entire lives. The sheriff arrived with two deputies, their patrol cars pulling up outside the diner with lights flashing. Sheriff Margaret Dawson was a woman in her late 40s, weathered by years of dealing with small-town disputes and weekend drunks. She walked into the diner expecting a routine disturbance call. What she found instead made her 20 years of experience feel suddenly inadequate. "Sheriff?" Pembroke greeted her with a slight nod, handing her a business card embossed with gold lettering. "Thank you for your prompt response. I am James Pembroke, Chief of Staff to His Grace, the Duke of Ashford. This is a matter requiring your immediate attention." Sheriff Dawson's eyes widened as she read the card, then looked at Alexander, then at the three men who appeared ready to collapse, and finally at the young woman wrapped in an expensive suit jacket, her eyes still glistening with tears. "Someone wants to tell me what happened here?" she asked, her hand instinctively moving to rest on her duty belt. "These three men assaulted my sister," Alexander said, his voice carrying across the silent diner, "physically and verbally. They tore her clothing. They humiliated her while every person in this establishment watched and did nothing." The scarred man found his voice, desperate and cracking. "We didn't know. We didn't know who she was. If you'd known, you wouldn't have done it?" Alexander's voice cut like a whip. "So you only assault women you believe have no protection? Women you think are powerless? Tell me, does that make it better or worse?" The man's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, a fish drowning in the air. Sheriff Dawson surveyed the scene, her jaw tightening. She'd seen her share of bullies, and she recognized the type immediately. But she also recognized something else. This situation was a powder keg, and she needed to handle it carefully. "Deputies, take statements from these three, separately." She turned to Elena, her voice gentling. "Miss, I'm going to need your statement as well. Are you comfortable talking here, or would you prefer the station?" Before Elena could answer, the diner door opened again. A woman in her 60s rushed in, her apron still dusted with flour, her face flushed with exertion. "Elena! Oh my God, Elena! Mrs. Chen!" Elena's voice cracked with surprise. The woman hurried to Elena, ignoring everyone else in the room, including the imposing Duke. She took Elena's face in her flour-dusted hands, examining her with the practiced care of someone who'd spent a lifetime worrying about others. "I was in the back kitchen. I just heard what happened." "Oh, sweetheart, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry I wasn't out here." Mrs. Chen's eyes filled with tears. "You come to my diner for months, always so kind, always so polite. And this happens?" Alexander's expression shifted, confusion flickering across his features. "Months?" he repeated. Mrs. Chen finally looked at him, seemingly unbothered by his imposing presence. "Your sister comes here every Wednesday for 3 months. Always order the same thing. Scrambled eggs, wheat toast, coffee with cream. Always sits in the same booth. Always leaves a generous tip, even though she barely touches her food." She turned back to Elena. "I thought you just needed a quiet place to think. I never imagined—" Elena felt her brother's eyes on her, questions burning behind them. She'd told the family she spent her Wednesdays at charity meetings, at the estate library, at social engagements. She'd never mentioned driving 3 hours to sit alone in a small-town diner, desperately seeking normalcy. "We'll discuss this later," Alexander said quietly. But Elena heard the hurt beneath his words. She'd lied to him, not directly but through omission, and they both knew it. Sheriff Dawson cleared her throat. "I need to take everyone's statements. This is a clear case of assault. These men will be charged." The leader of the bullies dropped to his knees, literally begging. "Please, Your Grace, please. We made a mistake. A terrible mistake. Please don't." "Don't what?" Alexander's voice was glacial. "Don't hold you accountable for your actions? Don't ensure that you face consequences? Tell me, what would you have done if no one had walked through that door? How far would you have gone?" The silence that followed was answer enough. And in that silence, Elena made a decision that would change everything. "I want to press charges," she said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "But I also want something else. I want every person in this diner who sat and watched to understand what their silence cost." She looked around the room, meeting eyes that quickly looked away, finding the courage she'd thought those men had stolen from her. "My brother can't always be there. No one's brother can. So the next time you see someone being hurt, ask yourself, what kind of person do I want to be when it matters?" The shame that blanketed the diner was almost palpable. Sheriff Dawson nodded with respect. "Well said, miss. Now let's get these statements done and get these men where they belong." As the deputies began separating the three bullies, Alexander leaned close to his sister. "You've been coming here for 3 months," he whispered. "Why didn't you tell me?" Elena looked up at him, this powerful man who'd always protected her, and saw not anger but genuine confusion and hurt. "Because," she said softly, "I needed to figure out who I am when I'm not standing in your shadow." The truth hung between them, painful and necessary, and everything neither of them had said for years suddenly demanded to be heard. The sheriff's station was a modest building with fluorescent lights that hummed too loudly and linoleum floors that squeaked beneath expensive shoes. Alexander sat in an uncomfortable plastic chair outside the interview room where Elena was giving her statement, his posture rigid, his jaw clenched so tight it ached. Pembroke stood nearby, phone pressed to his ear, coordinating with their legal team. "Yes, I want a full background check on all three. Employment history, criminal records, everything. And I want to know who owns that diner building. Yes, all of it, by tonight." Alexander barely heard him. His mind was stuck on 5 words. 3 months she's been going. 3 months of Wednesdays. 3 months of lies. Small ones perhaps, but lies nonetheless. 3 months of his sister seeking something she couldn't find at home, in the estate that had been their family's legacy for 12 generations. The interview room door opened and Elena emerged looking exhausted. Her eyes were red-rimmed but dry now. She'd tucked his suit jacket around herself like armor. "All done?" Alexander asked, standing. She nodded silently. Sheriff Dawson appeared behind her. "We have everything we need. The charges are solid: assault, destruction of property, disturbing the peace. With the witness statements, including Mrs. Chen's testimony about what she heard from the kitchen, this is about as open and shut as it gets." "And their bail?" Alexander's voice was controlled, but Elena knew him well enough to hear the edge beneath it. "That'll be set by Judge Morrison, probably tomorrow morning. Standard procedure." "I'd like to speak with the judge personally." Sheriff Dawson's expression tightened. "Your Grace, I understand you're upset, but I can't have you. I'm not asking to interfere with the legal process, Sheriff. I'm asking to provide context. There's a difference." His tone left no room for argument. "My family has contributed significantly to this county's infrastructure, education, and emergency services. I think Judge Morrison would appreciate hearing directly from me about the severity of this incident." It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of fact. But facts, when spoken by someone with enough power, could sound a lot like threats anyway. Elena touched his arm. "Alexander, can we just go? Please?" He looked down at her, and his expression softened immediately. "Of course. Pembroke, bring the car around." "Actually," Elena said quietly, "I drove myself. My car's still at the diner." Another reminder of her secret Wednesdays. Another small revelation of the separate life she'd been living. "Then we'll have someone collect it," Alexander said. "You're not going back there today." "I'm not a child, Alexander." "No, you're a woman who was assaulted this afternoon. There's a difference." The sharpness in his voice made her flinch, and he immediately looked away, jaw working. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean—" "Yes, you did." Elena's voice was quiet but firm. "You're angry, not at those men, at me." "I'm not—" "You are, because I didn't tell you where I was going, because I kept something from you." She stepped closer, forcing him to meet her eyes. "But you want to know why I needed that diner, Alexander? Because at home, at the estate, at every social function and charity gala, I'm not Elena. I'm the Duke's sister. I'm a chess piece in everyone else's games. I'm a title before I'm a person." The words landed like blows, and Alexander felt each one. That's not fair, he said, his voice rough. Everything I've done has been to protect you. I know, and I love you for it. But sometimes protection feels like a cage. Tears welled in her eyes again. I just wanted one place where I could be nobody, where I could sit and think and not have every choice analyzed, every word measured. Is that so terrible? Alexander looked at his sister, really looked at her, and saw not the little girl he'd taught to ride horses, not the teenager he'd scared away unsuitable boyfriends from, but a woman desperate for autonomy in a world that had decided her value before she'd ever had a chance to define it herself. No, he said finally, his voice breaking slightly. It's not terrible. It's human. And I'm sorry you felt you couldn't tell me. Elena wiped her eyes. I'm sorry I didn't trust you enough to try. They stood in the harsh fluorescent light of the sheriff's station, surrounded by the mundane machinery of small-town justice, and confronted a truth that money and titles couldn't fix. Love without trust was just another kind of loneliness. Pembroke appeared at the entrance. The car is ready, Your Grace. Alexander offered his arm to Elena. Come home. We'll talk. Really talk. No titles, no expectations. Just us. Elena hesitated for only a moment before taking his arm. But as they walked toward the door, Sheriff Dawson's phone rang. She answered, listened, and her face went pale. Wait, she called out. Your Grace, we have a problem. Alexander turned. What kind of problem? The 3 men you had arrested? Their bail was just posted. All of it. Anonymously. She looked at her phone screen, disbelief evident. Someone just paid $50,000 to get them out. The air in the room went cold. Who? Alexander's voice was deadly quiet. That's just it, Sheriff Dawson said, her hand tightening on her phone. We have no idea. The drive back to the estate was tense, the luxury sedan cutting through the countryside as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. Elena sat in the back beside Alexander, watching the landscape blur past while Pembroke made call after call from the front passenger seat, trying to trace the anonymous payment. It doesn't make sense, Alexander muttered, his fingers drumming against his knee, a rare tell of agitation. $50,000 to bail out 3 small-town thugs? No one does that out of charity. Elena's stomach twisted. She'd been thinking the same thing, turning over possibilities in her mind, each one worse than the last. Maybe they have a family with money? Pembroke already checked. One works at an auto shop, one's unemployed, and the leader is a part-time construction worker. Between the 3 of them, they couldn't scrape together $5,000, let alone $50,000. The car turned onto the long private drive leading to Ashford Estate. The manor house rose in the distance, its Georgian architecture gilded by the fading sunlight. Normally, the sight of home brought Elena comfort. Today, it looked like a fortress. They'd barely crossed the threshold when the head housekeeper, Mrs. Whitmore, appeared, her usually composed face etched with worry. Your Grace, there's someone waiting for you in the blue drawing room. He insisted it was urgent and said you'd want to see him immediately. Who? Alexander was already moving, his protective instincts on high alert. Mr. Marcus Hartley, Your Grace. Alexander stopped dead. Elena watched her brother's face cycle through shock, anger, and something that looked disturbingly like fear. Who's Marcus Hartley? She asked. Alexander's jaw clenched. Someone I haven't seen in 15 years. Someone I never wanted you to meet. He turned to Pembroke. Take Elena upstairs. No. Elena planted her feet. I'm done being protected from things I deserve to know about. Who is he, Alexander? Her brother closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them, Elena saw something she'd rarely witnessed. Shame. He's our uncle, Alexander said quietly, our father's younger brother. Elena's breath caught. We don't have an uncle. Father was an only child. You told me. I lied. The admission seemed to cost him. Marcus was disinherited 20 years ago, before you were born. He did something unforgivable, and Father erased him from the family history. Made us promise never to speak his name. What did he do? Elena, what did he do, Alexander? Before he could answer, a voice drifted from the drawing room, smooth and cultured, with an undercurrent of mockery. Why don't you let me tell her myself, nephew? A man appeared in the doorway. He was perhaps 60, impeccably dressed in a Savile Row suit with silver hair and features that were unmistakably Ashford. He had the same strong jaw, the same aristocratic nose. But where Alexander's eyes held steel and honor, this man held something calculating and cold. "Hello, Elena," Marcus said, his smile not reaching his eyes. "You've grown into quite the beauty. You look just like your mother." Elena instinctively stepped closer to Alexander. "You paid their bail. Why?" Marcus's smile widened. "Clever girl. Yes, I paid for it. Consider it an investment." "In what?" Alexander's voice was granite. "In leverage." Marcus pulled out his phone, tapping the screen before turning it to face them. "You see, that diner has security cameras. Very thorough ones. And I now own the footage of everything that happened today." Elena's blood ran cold. The assault, the humiliation, the tears. Marcus continued, his voice almost gentle. "All captured in high definition. Can you imagine what the tabloids would pay for that? Duke's sister attacked. Exclusive footage. It would go viral within hours. Elena's worst moment. Played on loop across the internet for millions to see." "You bastard," Alexander breathed. "Perhaps." Marcus pocketed his phone. "But I'm a bastard with something you want. And coincidentally, you have something I want." "What?" Elena's voice shook. Marcus's expression turned serious, all pretense of pleasantry vanishing. "The Ashford Trust. The one father set up before he died. The one that can only be accessed with the consent of both living Ashford heirs." His eyes locked on Alexander. "You and me, nephew. We're the only two left who can unlock it. That trust is for charitable foundations, for preserving the family legacy. That trust contains £50 million, and I want my half." Marcus's voice hardened. "Sign over access, or that footage goes public. You have 48 hours to decide." "Here's a question for you. If you were in their position, would you give in to blackmail to protect someone you love? Or would you call the bluff and face the consequences? Let me know in the comments." Elena felt the room spinning. This wasn't just about the diner anymore. This was about family secrets, about money, about a man willing to weaponize her trauma for profit. "Get out of my house," Alexander said, his voice barely above a whisper but carrying the weight of centuries of authority. "Our house, technically. Or have you forgotten that Ashford Estate is entailed? It belongs to the title, not to you personally." Marcus headed toward the door, then paused. 48 hours, Alexander. Think about what matters more, your pride or your sister's dignity." The door closed behind him with a soft click that sounded like a gunshot. Elena's legs gave out. Alexander caught her, guiding her to a nearby chair. "I'm sorry," he whispered, kneeling beside her. "I'm so sorry. I should have told you about him. I should have. He's going to release that video, isn't he?" Elena's voice was hollow. "Even if you give him what he wants." Alexander's silence was answer enough. They'd faced down 3 bullies in a diner, but the real enemy had been waiting at home all along, and he knew exactly how to hurt them where they were most vulnerable. The next 24 hours unfolded like a nightmare in slow motion. Alexander locked himself in his study with Pembroke and a team of lawyers, searching desperately for legal loopholes. Precedents, anything that could stop Marcus from releasing the footage or accessing the trust. Elena could hear their muffled voices through the heavy oak door, arguments rising and falling, phones ringing constantly, the sound of her brother's fists slamming against the desk in frustration. She sat alone in her room, still wearing Alexander's suit jacket over the torn blouse she couldn't bring herself to throw away. Evidence, the sheriff had called it. Evidence of her humiliation, now digitally preserved and held hostage by a man she'd never even known existed. Her phone buzzed constantly. News traveled fast in their social circles, and somehow word had leaked that something had happened involving the Duke's sister. The vultures were circling, disguised as concerned friends. "Are you all right? I heard there was an incident." "Darling, call me. The rumors are absolutely wild." "Elena, whatever happened, you know you can trust me." She turned the phone off and threw it across the room. A soft knock came at her door. "Miss Elena," Mrs. Whitmore's gentle voice, "you haven't eaten anything all day. I've brought soup. I'm not hungry. I'll leave it outside the door, dear." Just in case. Elena listened to the housekeeper's footsteps fade, then buried her face in her hands. The tears came again, hot and angry. She'd thought the worst part was the attack itself, the fear, the violation, the shame. But this was worse. This was the wound being ripped open again and again, the threat of it being displayed for the world's entertainment. And the worst part, the absolutely crushing part, this was tearing her and Alexander apart. Around midnight, she heard shouting from downstairs. She crept to the top of the grand staircase and listened. Completely unreasonable. That was Pembroke. Your Grace, you cannot seriously be considering... What choice do I have? Alexander's voice was raw, broken. If that footage goes public, it destroys her. Every time she walks into a room for the rest of her life, people will have seen that video. They'll know. They'll whisper. They'll pity her, or worse, they'll mock her. But the trust that money is meant for, I don't care about the money. Something shattered, glass against wall. I care about my sister. I care about protecting her from this. And what happens when Marcus takes the money and releases the video anyway? What then? Silence, long and terrible. Then at least I tried, Alexander whispered. Elena's heart shattered. Her brother, powerful, unshakable Alexander, was breaking, and it was her fault. If she'd never gone to that diner, if she'd never sought out that stupid illusion of normalcy, none of this would have happened. She retreated to her room and did something she'd been avoiding. She pulled out her laptop and searched for her uncle's name. What she found made her blood run cold. Marcus Hartley had been disinherited not for financial impropriety or scandal, but for blackmail. He'd attempted to extort their grandfather using fabricated evidence about a business competitor. When the grandfather refused to cooperate, Marcus had released the information anyway, destroying an innocent man's reputation. The grandfather had proven the evidence was false, but the damage was done. Marcus didn't make deals. He took what he wanted and destroyed people anyway, which meant no matter what Alexander did, that video would go public. They'd already lost. They just didn't know it yet. Elena stood and walked to her window, looking out over the darkened estate grounds. In the reflection, she barely recognized herself. Eyes hollow, face pale, shoulders slumped with defeat. She'd spent months trying to figure out who she was beyond her title. Now she was about to become famous for the worst moment of her life. Her phone, powered back on, buzzed with a new message from an unknown number. 36 hours left. Choose wisely. Elena made a decision. If this was going to destroy her anyway, she wouldn't let it destroy Alexander too. She sat down and began to write. A letter handwritten, the way their mother had taught them. Words she needed her brother to understand. By the time you read this, I'll be gone. Not forever. Just long enough for you to think clearly. Don't give him anything. Don't sacrifice the family legacy for me. I'm not worth 50 million pounds, and we both know he'll betray you anyway. I love you. I'm sorry. Elena. She packed a small bag, taking only essentials and the emergency credit card Alexander didn't know she knew about. At 3 in the morning, she slipped out through the servant's entrance and walked to the garage where her car had been delivered from the diner. She had no plan, no destination. She just knew she couldn't watch her brother destroy everything their family had built to protect her from consequences that were already inevitable. The estate gates closed behind her, and Elena drove into the darkness, more alone than she'd ever been. Behind her, in his study, Alexander finally made his decision and reached for the phone to call Marcus. Neither of them knew that salvation would come from the most unexpected source. Elena drove aimlessly for 2 hours before exhaustion forced her to pull into a rest stop. She sat in her car watching the sky lighten from black to deep purple, feeling completely hollow. Her phone rang. Alexander. She declined the call. It rang again and again. On the 4th call, she answered. I'm not coming back. Elena, where are you? Alexander's voice was frantic. I found your letter. Please just come home. We'll figure this out together. There's nothing to figure out. He wins. That's how this ends. That's not... I looked him up, Alexander. I know what he did to my grandfather's friend. He doesn't honor deals. He just takes and destroys. Her voice cracked. So I'm not letting you sacrifice everything for nothing. Elena, she hung up and turned off her phone. As dawn broke fully, Elena realized where her subconscious had been driving her all along. She was 20 minutes from the diner. She didn't know why she felt pulled there. Maybe because it was where everything had fallen apart. Maybe because it was the last place she'd felt like herself, even if only for a moment. The diner's lights were on, warm and inviting in the early morning gray. Through the window, she could see Mrs. Chen wiping down tables, preparing for the breakfast rush. Before she could talk herself out of it, Elena walked in. Mrs. Chen looked up, and her face immediately flooded with concern. Elena, oh, sweetheart, what are you doing here? I heard about... She noticed Elena's disheveled appearance, the dark circles under her eyes. Come here, sit. Within minutes, Elena found herself in the same booth where everything had happened. A plate of scrambled eggs in front of her that she couldn't eat, and Mrs. Chen sitting across from her with a cup of tea. I can't go back, Elena whispered. Everything's ruined. My uncle, he has footage of what happened. He's going to release it unless Alexander gives him millions. But I know he'll release it anyway. It's what he does. Mrs. Chen listened silently, her weathered hands wrapped around her teacup. I just wanted one place where I could be normal, Elena continued, the words pouring out. Where I wasn't a title or a bargaining chip. Where I was just me. And now that's being taken away too. Who says it's being taken away? Mrs. Chen asked quietly. Everyone will see it. Everyone will know. I'll never just be Elena again. Elena, Mrs. Chen said firmly, I'm going to tell you something my mother told me when I came to this country with nothing. She said, people can take your money, your home, your dignity, but they can't take who you are unless you let them. It's not that simple, isn't it? Mrs. Chen leaned forward. Those men tried to humiliate you, but you stood up. You pressed charges. You used your voice. That's who you are, not the girl in whatever video that horrible man has. You. Elena felt something crack inside her chest, not breaking, but breaking open. And about that video, Mrs. Chen continued, pulling out her phone. I've been talking to my nephew. He's good with computers. Very good. She showed Elena her screen. My diner has cameras, yes, but I own the footage. Not whoever bought the building. And my nephew, he helped me do something called cloud backup with extra encryption. Very secure. Elena's heart began to pound. Mrs. Chen, what are you saying? I'm saying I checked this morning. Someone hacked my security system 2 days ago and copied files. But my nephew, he put something in the code. What did he call it? A watermark? It means we can prove if someone releases footage, they stole it. Federal crime, he says. Mrs. Chen's eyes glinted. And I have a feeling I know who might have stolen from a little old lady's diner. For the first time in 24 hours, Elena felt something other than despair. Hope. But that doesn't stop him from releasing it, she said. No, Mrs. Chen agreed, but it gives you power. When he releases it, he goes to prison for theft. You have leverage now, Elena. The question is, what are you going to do with it? Elena pulled out her phone and turned it on. 17 missed calls from Alexander. 6 voicemails. She stood, and for the first time since the attack, she felt like herself again. Not helpless, not a victim. Angry. Mrs. Chen, I need to use your phone. And then I need you to tell me everything your nephew can do with computer security. Mrs. Chen smiled. That's the girl I know. Elena was done running. It was time to fight back. Elena arrived back at Ashford Estate exactly 30 minutes before Marcus's deadline expired. Alexander was standing on the front steps, looking like he hadn't slept in days. When he saw her car pull up the drive, the relief on his face was so profound, it nearly broke her resolve. Elena, is he here yet? She asked, stepping out of the car with a confidence that made her brother pause. He's waiting in the drawing room. Elena, I was going to sign. No, you weren't. She touched his arm. Trust me, please. Something in her eyes, a determination he'd never quite seen before, made Alexander nod slowly. They walked in together to find Marcus lounging in their father's favorite chair, a gesture of dominance that wasn't lost on anyone. Pembroke stood to the side, his expression carefully neutral, a tablet in his hands. Ah, the prodigal sister returns, Marcus said, checking his watch. With 28 minutes to spare. How dramatic. I assume Alexander has told you he's agreed to my terms? He hasn't agreed to anything, Elena said clearly, because we have new terms. Marcus's smile faltered slightly. I don't think you understand how blackmail works, dear niece. I have the footage. You have nothing. Actually, you have stolen property, Elena said. You illegally hacked into Mrs. Chen's security system and copied files without authorization. That's a federal crime. Computer fraud and abuse. Mrs. Chen's nephew embedded tracking code and watermarks in all her footage. The moment you release that video, we can prove you stole it. Prison time, Uncle Marcus. Minimum of 5 years. The color drained from Marcus's face. You're bluffing, he said, but his voice wavered. Mr. Pembroke. Elena nodded to the chief of staff. Pembroke turned his tablet to show a video call. A young man in his 20s with glasses appeared on screen, surrounded by computer monitors. Hi, I'm David Chen. I'm a cybersecurity analyst for the FBI. Well, I was until I took personal leave this morning to help my aunt. He held up a document. This is a federal warrant for the arrest of Marcus Hartley for unauthorized access to a computer system and theft of digital property. We traced his IP address to a hotel in town. The encryption he used was decent, but not that decent. Marcus stood abruptly. This is absurd. You can't. We already did, Elena said. But here's the thing, Uncle Marcus. I don't want you in prison. I want you gone. She pulled out a document from her bag and placed it on the table between them. This is a formal relinquishment of any claim to the Ashford Trust, the estate, or any family assets. You sign this, and we drop the charges. You disappear from our lives permanently. You don't sign it, and David here forwards his evidence to his colleagues who are still on active duty. You can't force me to sign away my rights. No, but I can offer you a choice, Elena said, her voice steel wrapped in silk. Prison or exile, freedom or felony. Choose wisely, you have 2 minutes. Alexander stood beside his sister, and in that moment, Marcus saw not a broken young woman and her protective brother, but 2 people who had found their strength together. This is insane, Marcus tried one more time. That video still exists. I could still release it from prison? Elena smiled, and it wasn't kind. You'd prove our case for us. Besides, Mrs. Chen has already given us the only complete copy. Yours? David encrypted it remotely. You try to open those files now, they self-destruct. Don't you, David? David grinned from the tablet screen. Military-grade ransomware, modified for defensive purposes. Very illegal if I were using it offensively. Totally legal when protecting stolen property. Isn't technology wonderful? Marcus's hands shook as he reached for the pen. One more thing, Alexander said quietly. You never come near my sister again, and I won't use lawyers. I'll use every ounce of influence this family has accumulated over 12 generations to make sure you disappear so completely, even you won't remember who you used to be. Do we understand each other? Marcus signed without another word. Within the hour, he was gone. No money, no leverage, no power. Just a broken man who'd gambled everything on cruelty and lost. Elena and Alexander stood in the drawing room after Pembroke escorted Marcus out, the silence finally peaceful instead of oppressive. When did you become so fierce? Alexander asked, wondering in his voice. When I realized I didn't need to be protected, Elena said. I needed to be trusted. Alexander pulled his sister into a hug, and for the first time in days, they both felt like they could breathe. They'd won. Together. 3 weeks later, Elena walked into the diner on a Wednesday afternoon, just like she had for months. But everything was different now. The story had made headlines, but not the way Marcus had planned. Duke's sister stops blackmail plot read better than any humiliation piece ever could. The 3 men who'd assaulted her had pleaded guilty to avoid trial, receiving community service, mandatory counseling, and restraining orders. It wasn't prison, but it was justice, the kind that might actually change them instead of just punishing them. Mrs. Chen looked up from the counter and smiled. The usual? Actually, Elena said, sliding into her familiar booth, I think I'll try something different today. Mrs. Chen's eyes twinkled with understanding. Coming right up. The bell above the door chimed and Alexander walked in, looking distinctly out of place in his tailored suit among the vinyl booths and checkered floors. Several customers recognized him and whispered, but he ignored them, heading straight for Elena's booth. "You're late," she teased as he slid in across from her. Pembroke had updates about the charity foundation. He looked around the diner, really seeing it for the first time. "So this is where you've been finding yourself?" "This is where I've been trying," Elena corrected. "I think I'm still figuring it out." "Good," Alexander said. "You should take your time. And for what it's worth, I'm sorry I made you feel like you had to hide this from me. I'm sorry I didn't trust you enough to share it." Mrs. Orange. Chen arrived with 2 plates, scrambled eggs and toast for Elena, and a pancake special for Alexander. "On the house," she said. "For family." After she left, Alexander picked up his fork, then paused. "I've been thinking about what you said, about standing in my shadow, about needing to find out who you are." "Alexander, let me finish." He took a breath. "I'm establishing a new charitable foundation, independent from the Ashford Trust, using my personal funds. It's going to focus on supporting victims of assault and harassment, providing legal aid, counseling, and security. The kind of help people need when they can't fight back on their own." Elena's throat tightened. "And I want you to run it," Alexander continued. "Not as my sister, as yourself. Elena Ashford, not the Duke's sister. Your foundation, your vision, your purpose. If you want it." Tears blurred Elena's vision, but these were different from the ones she'd cried 3 weeks ago. These were tears of recognition, of being truly seen. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I want it." "There's one condition," Alexander said, and she looked up warily. "You have to promise to tell me when you need help, not because I want to control you, but because people who love each other don't have to face things alone. Deal?" Elena reached across the table and took her brother's hand. "Deal." They sat in the diner, eating breakfast at 3 in the afternoon, and for the first time in their lives, they weren't the Duke and his sister. They were just Alexander and Elena, 2 people who'd learned that strength wasn't about standing alone. It was about knowing when to stand together. Outside, the sun broke through the clouds, sending shafts of golden light through the windows. Mrs. Chen watched them from behind the counter and smiled. She'd seen a lot of stories unfold in this diner over the years. But this one was special. Because it was a story about finding yourself, not by running away from who you are, but by embracing every part of it. The title, the responsibility, the vulnerability, and the strength. Elena looked around the diner, at the place that had seen her at her lowest, and somehow became part of her salvation. She thought about the girl who'd sat here 3 weeks ago, desperate to be invisible. She wasn't that girl anymore. She was someone who'd learned that being seen, truly seen, wasn't something to fear. It was something to fight for. "What are you thinking?" Alexander asked. Elena smiled. "I'm thinking that Wednesdays are going to be a lot more interesting from now on. Because I'm joining you? Because I'm not hiding anymore." The brothers and sisters who'd learned to truly trust each other finished their meal, left a generous tip, and walked out into the sunlight together. Behind them, the diner continued its gentle rhythm, coffee brewing, conversations flowing, the everyday magic of people finding connection in the most ordinary places. And sometimes, if you listened closely, you could hear the sound of someone finding themselves. So here's my final question for you. What does strength mean to you? Is it standing alone or knowing when to ask for help? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your perspective. And if this story touched your heart, if it reminded you that even in our darkest moments we can find our way back to the light, please like, share, and subscribe, because everyone deserves a reminder that they're stronger than they think. This emotional journey took us from humiliation to triumph, from isolation to connection, and from fear to fierce courage. Elena learned that strength isn't about being invulnerable, it's about being authentic. Alexander learned that protection without trust is just another form of control. And together they discovered that family isn't about titles or estates, it's about showing up for each other when it matters most. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.